The third relay station stopped answering on a Tuesday. By the time the fourth one went dark, an entire civilization realized nobody was coming to save them. 31 galactic allies received their distress signal. 30 sent condolences, legal advice, and prayers. Only humanity replied with 2 words. Stand by. And 37 hours later, the galaxy learned why you never make humans watch children become orphans. If you've ever wanted to see cold, bureaucratic indifference smashed apart by people willing to risk everything for strangers, hit that like button, subscribe, and get ready for one of the most emotionally satisfying HFY revenge stories you'll ever hear. Full narrative expansion. Esreth had spent 412 years filing reports. That wasn't an exaggeration. That was his life. Every Tuesday, he filed the grain shipment report for the Kelpari colony on Ver Prime. Every Tuesday for 4 centuries. The same forms. The same confirmations. The same quiet certainty that civilization worked because people like him maintained it carefully. The Kelhari believed in patience the way other species believed in religion. Their hearts beat only 11 times per minute. Their conversations moved slowly. Their emotions settled like sediment in deep water. They even had a word for it. Vetha. The virtue of unhurried certainty. And for thousands of years, it had worked. Until the relay stations stopped answering. The first silence was easy to explain away. Equipment failure. Solar interference. Maintenance backlog. Esreth filed the appropriate forms. The second relay station went dark the next morning. Again, he followed procedure. Again, he trusted the system. Because systems didn't fail. People maintained them. That was what civilization meant. Then the mountains outside his office window turned orange. Not sunrise orange. Not fire orange. Something worse. Something his language had no word for. Esreth remembered staring at the mountains for several long seconds, while his hands continued writing the date, at the top of a report that no longer mattered. Because his body still believed it was Tuesday. Then the alarms began. The sound rolled through the capital like an ancient predator waking up. Outside, the streets filled with confused citizens moving in slow, uncertain waves. Kelhari didn't panic. Panic required instinct. Fear required speed. But now, nobody knew what procedure applied when the sky itself looked wrong. Esreth found his deputy, Orvesh, standing frozen outside the administrative building clutching a shaking data tablet. What does protocol require? Esreth asked calmly. Orvesh swallowed hard. We are to report to Central Coordination and await orders from the planetary governor. Good, Esreth replied. And while the eastern sky burned like the end of the world, they walked. Because Kelhari always walked. Even toward catastrophe. The coordination center was chaos by Kelhari standards. Which meant people were speaking over one another by half a second. Satellite images loaded line by line onto enormous displays. Partial distress signals flooded the room. Entire colonies had vanished from communication. And still, Esreth kept working. He sat at a console, opened the emergency communication array, and sent a distress signal to every species in the Galactic Compact. 31 governments. 31 allies. 31 civilizations that had signed mutual defense agreements beneath smiling cameras and ceremonial speeches 17 years earlier. Then he waited. The first response arrived quickly. The Drill Consortium offered mediation. The Shantari Collective promised prayers. The Udra Mercantile Alliance requested clarification regarding territorial ownership now that Kelhari systems were under evolving administrative circumstances. Esreth read every response carefully. Every polished sentence. Every meaningless word. Then he saw humanity's reply. 2 words. Stand by. That was it. No speeches. No condolences. No diplomatic theatre. Just stand by. Esreth read the message 3 times. Something about it disturbed him. Not because it was cold. Because it moved. Kelhari thoughts settled slowly into certainty. But these words refused to settle. They stayed alive inside his mind. The evacuation began hours later. 4,000 survivors boarded the final transport vessel leaving the dying planet behind. Esreth sat near the front beside Orvesh. When Orvesh quietly asked if he was all right, Esreth stared ahead and answered truthfully. I left a report unfinished on my desk. That broke something inside Orvesh. Not because it was absurd. Because it wasn't. That unfinished report represented an entire civilization built on trust, order, and process. And all of it had just burned. The days aboard the refugee vessel became unbearable in their silence. 19 days of food. 12 days to reach a secondary corridor. No military escort. No reinforcements. No rescue fleet. Committee meetings filled every cycle. Every discussion was the same. How long could they survive? Who was coming? Esreth answered each question with brutal precision. No optimism. No comforting lies. Just arithmetic. And every equation ended the same way. Death. Still, he kept thinking about those 2 human words. Stand by. Meanwhile, the ship itself began showing strain. A crack appeared in Corridor 7. Tiny. Cosmetic. Harmless. But Esreth visited it every night. Measuring it silently with 2 fingers. Because when everything else in your life becomes uncontrollable, the mind clings to something measurable. Even a crack in the floor. Then came the signal. Day 11. A young communications officer named Petrov dragged Esreth to the relay room. There's something you need to hear. The transmission crackled through static. A human woman's voice. Tired. Focused. Determined. Fuel calculations are wrong, we go anyway. Static swallowed half the message. Then her voice returned. It doesn't matter what it costs. Another burst of interference. Then clearly. Tell them 37 hours. Silence. Petrov stared nervously at Esreth. But Esreth couldn't speak. Because something impossible was happening inside him. A pressure in his chest loosened. His breathing changed. And suddenly, he made a sound. Short. Sharp. Violent. Petrov nearly jumped out of his seat. Because Kelhari did not laugh. Ever. But Esreth had just laughed for the first time in over 4 centuries. And moments later, tears began running down his face. He stood there trembling quietly while water streamed from eyes that had never cried before. Because somewhere beyond impossible odds, someone was still coming. The Voran fleet arrived 6 hours early. Sensor grids flooded with enemy ships. 40. 50. 60. An armada large enough to erase the refugee vessel without slowing down. The committee finally lost hope. Pella, the sharpest elder aboard, looked at the tactical display and whispered. I do not believe the humans are coming. Esreth looked at the countdown timer. 6 hours remaining. The humans said 37 hours, he replied calmly. Pella closed her eyes. 6 hours is a very long time. She was right. The Voran opened communication channels soon after. Formal surrender demands. Cold certainty. Absolute confidence. The language of predators who had done this many times before. Esreth listened. Filed the transmission in his notebook. And waited. Hour 37 arrived. Nothing. No signal. No fleet. Only silence. Then. The sensor grid exploded. A new mass signature appeared from deep transit space. Too many returns for the system to process individually. Moving impossibly fast. Humanity had arrived. The human commander's voice filled the refugee ship moments later. Clear. Calm. Direct. Terran compact emergency response fleet entering engagement range. No fear. No hesitation. Then she contacted the Voran directly. Her name was Commander Nina Osai. And in a voice steady enough to freeze blood. She informed the Voran fleet they were targeting civilian refugees protected under Terran defense accords. Then she gave them a choice. Withdraw. Or face humanity. The Voran remained silent. Nina waited exactly 90 seconds. Then she delivered the sentence the entire galaxy would remember forever. You picked the wrong species to make orphans of. The battle that followed wasn't elegant. It wasn't strategic brilliance. It wasn't technological superiority. Humanity was outnumbered 2-1. Half their fleet consisted of modified civilian ships barely held together by desperation and engineering nightmares. And they fought anyway. Ships caught fire. Hull sections ruptured. Civilian transports rammed warships to protect damaged escorts. Human pilots laughed over open comms while their vessels broke apart around them. The Voran had never encountered this before. Not courage. Not sacrifice. Those existed everywhere. No. They had never encountered a species willing to completely ignore the math. Humans treated impossible odds like a personal insult. 4 hours later. The Voran fleet withdrew. Not destroyed. Not defeated. But shaken. Because for the first time in centuries, something had refused to behave rationally. 40 minutes later, the Terran flagship docked with the refugee vessel. Esreth walked slowly toward the airlock. Because Kelhari always walked. The doors opened. And standing there, covered in engine grease, exhausted beyond belief, eating half a protein bar, was a young human engineer. 23 years old. Dark circles under her eyes. Hands stained black from emergency repairs. She looked at the ancient alien administrator in front of her and asked softly. Hey, you okay? Not politically. Not diplomatically. Not philosophically. Just. Right now. Are you okay? Esreth stared at her. At the human who had crossed impossible space despite fuel shortages and death odds and common sense itself. And for the first time in his life. He answered honestly. No. The engineer nodded gently. Like that answer was acceptable. Then she broke her protein bar in half. And handed him one piece. Climactic revenge payoff, 1 to 2 minutes. 1 year later, Esreth stood before the Galactic Compact Assembly. 1,000 delegates watched silently. The same governments that had offered prayers. Condolences. Legal consultations. All waiting to hear the Kelhari survivor speak. Esreth approached the podium carrying 7 perfectly prepared diplomatic speeches. Then ignored every one of them. Instead, he told the truth. He described the unanswered distress signals, the committees, the waiting, the fear, the silence. Then he looked directly at the assembly and said quietly, "We followed every procedure correctly." A pause. The correct people offered condolences. Another pause. Then the line that shattered the room. The humans showed up. Complete silence filled the chamber. Esreth slowly removed an old foil wrapper from his pocket. Half a protein bar wrapper. Saved for over a year. A reminder that while the galaxy debated policy, humanity crossed impossible space to ask strangers if they were okay. That was the revenge. Not destruction. Not humiliation. Exposure. The entire Galactic Compact was forced to confront what they truly were. Observers. Cowards. Administrators hiding behind process while civilians burned. And humanity. Humanity became the species that acted. The species that came anyway. The species willing to risk everything simply because leaving people behind felt wrong. The treaty revisions passed unanimously. But the real victory had already happened. Because every species in that room now understood something terrifying. Humans were not governed by probability. They were governed by conviction. And those are far more dangerous. Reflective wrap-up, 15 to 20 seconds. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge through destruction. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is proving that compassion is stronger than fear, and exposing everyone who chose comfort over courage. The galaxy offered sympathy. Humanity offered itself. And that changed everything. If this story hit you right in the chest, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Would you have answered the distress signal, or stayed safely behind procedure like the rest of the galaxy? And of course, subscribe for more unforgettable HFY and revenge stories where humanity reminds the universe exactly why we should never be underestimated.